welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. It is May 9th. I am your host, Tommy Brzee, and we wanted to jump in and start talking about collective bargaining. It's been a huge topic of conversation, but some of you might not fully understand what that means or what that will look like in college football, so I want to break down kind of what that, at least grand scheme of things, what that looks like. And then we'll get into a little bit of talk around Brian Kelly. He made some very interesting comments around NIL and the transfer portal, saying we are not in the market for buying players. And I have some thoughts of that. I think it's a very interesting comment that can be looked at a number of different ways. So I wanted to break down my thoughts. And then we'll get into the Monte Harrison case, someone that has really burst onto the scene a little bit the last couple of days. A very, very interesting story of a guy that was an MLB player not, 2 years ago and is now an Arkansas Razorback. But we'll get into the details of that in the segment 3, and then we'll finish it off with a Hot Take Thursday, and it's all about the Clemson Tigers and their use of the portal. They went another portal cycle without bringing anyone in. They had 13 guys walk out this offseason, so I want to break that down for you guys, give you guys my thoughts and how Clemson might be down a road they can't turn back on. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, get your comment on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of your screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have your question or comment on the screen, you get to, give to the company a little bit, and definitely have a fun back and forth here. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net if you'd like to use that. But let's jump right in and let's talk about collective bargaining, and it's really the future of college football. I think all of us have seen this new push towards the professionalism of college sports. We are well past the point where they are professional sports in my opinion, but it's about to get a little bit more crystallized, and we're about to have a little bit more of an understanding, and it's going to look just a little bit more like the NFL. So one of the big things we've talked about is the payment and NIL structure going into the next decade to 2 decades of college football. There's a ton of question around it, whether it's going to be full employment status, which seems to be kind of losing traction by the day. You have NIL structures that, include the collective as well as being able to pay athletes. You have a ton of different things that can be thrown around here and a ton of different ways to go about this. But revenue sharing is going to be a way about this. That is going to be something that is going to be used. There's no doubt in my mind. It will be a way that players get paid. That's just kind of the going theory and something that you've heard probably a lot about if you're following this type of thing. But the thing with revenue sharing is that's all well and good. It's great to have players cut in on some of the money that's coming in from these media deals and all of the money that's coming into these schools because of these players. Them getting a little bit of cut of that is not the worst thing in the world by any means. The problem with it is you need something else to go with that, which is collective bargaining. It opens you up to so many more dangerous situations if you don't have this in place. So just to kind of get into the weeds a little bit here, we talked about the House versus NCAA case for quite some time. It's the NIL back pay case that is going to totally change the way that college football works. It's going to likely cost the NCAA $2.7 billion over the next decade in the antitrust suits, and it's also going to cost a lot of different schools about 15 to 25 million a year when you come to revenue sharing, and that's something that not every school can handle. So in the House versus NCAA case, the trial date is for January 25th. It has to be dealt with before that. We've talked about that a little bit. The number that it probably would get to if it got to a courtroom would not be something that the NCAA can handle at this very moment in time. So I very much expect that to get fixed in the near future. But the thing is, with all of that, you can get rid of one suit. It doesn't mean another one can't pop up, right? And the way you protect yourself from that is having an agreement, having negotiations where the players are involved. So a players association is absolutely needed for the future of college football. It's something that I think will not only protect the student athletes and give them a voice in these conversations, but also gives the NCAA a little bit of peace of mind of, okay, they can't sue us for this, this, and this. Because everything right now, as we all know, is very, very murky. There's no real concrete rules. You can look in a number of different directions and find different loopholes and different confusing language throughout all of these NIL rules that open it up to a lot of gray area where suits start to happen, where lawsuits start to be filed, and that only spells trouble for these conferences, for the NCAA, and for college football overall. So I think one of the big things here to keep in mind is when we talk about the House versus NCAA case, it feels like 2.7 billion over the next decade. It's a crazy amount of money. There's no two ways about that. But the going theory, I suppose, because it is an antitrust case, the way that those usually go is if you go to court in those cases, the number goes up considerably. That's just kind of the way of things. That's the way that antitrust suits have gone in the past. And the number that people have circled for quite some time, if it were to go to trial in January 2025, is $4.2 billion. And that's a huge gap. The NCAA is in a position right now where they're not necessarily throwing money out the door. Now, they're in plenty good shape. The NCAA is not necessarily hurting for money by any means, but there's a huge difference between them having to give up 2.7 and 4.2 over the next decade because they need as much money as they possibly can, especially going into this changing of the guard and more conferences wanting to break off from the NCAA and the Group of Five wanting to do their own thing. All of these different things that are kind of coming at the NCAA, you need money to fight that, and you need money to have a seat at the table. I think we all understand that in college football, in sports, in life, money talks. So when you lose that amount of money, when you lose that amount of clout in that arena, it's going to hurt you. So the NCAA absolutely does not want this to go to trial. They absolutely want this done prior to that happening. But the thing is, they have to get it done as well as putting in a cohesive and good players association, or it's just going to happen all over again. So the players have, started to kind of kick around this idea. One of the things we've talked about is athletes.org, something that Jim Cavil has set up, and it's kind of a players association that is representing a ton of different big-time players, whether Malachi Moore is a part of this organization, the entire UAB football team joined up, which we did a segment on, I believe, last week. So there's a ton of different paths here, and I guess the big question is, what does this all kind of entail, and what does the future of college football look like? And we talked about what's being dubbed the modern model in the last, I believe last week sometime. We talked about what that would kind of look like and what the implications of that would be. And for the most part, it's revenue sharing would be a part of college football, and that's just kind of the way of things. But also collectives would be there. So you would still have that competitive advantage over other schools where, LSU's collective or Texas's collective is capable of things that, Toledo's and Akron's and even, Georgia Tech's or whoever's is not capable of. So that advantage for some teams financially will still play a part, but the revenue sharing will be a part of this and will, give credence to some of the smaller players. We'll be able to split this a little bit more evenly because, as we know with NIL, it's a sliding scale. And if you keep that sliding scale but add, a little bit extra cheddar on the bottom, you can split that more evenly among all the players, not just the top-end players, and you can probably have a more sustainable and more a safer way to go about business, because it could be a sketchy situation if you have collectives where the quarterback's making the most money and then you start doing revenue sharing and the quarterback's still making the most money. So I think if you do have collectives in on this conversation, it makes the splitting of the revenue sharing a little bit easier, to be totally honest with you, on all of the athletic departments across the country. We talked about the NCAA having to pay $2.7 billion over the next decade, and that does not remotely factor into what the Power Five is going to have to pay going forward when it comes to revenue sharing, the 15 to 25 million. So those two things are two separate entities, but obviously they play within each other because the NCAA being hurt hurts the entirety of college football. So it'll be really interesting to watch all of this stuff. I think a couple of different things that have been kicked around, and I think one of the things that has been really getting traction is this idea of signing kids not to super restrictive contracts necessarily, but signing them to contracts nonetheless and getting them on the books for 2 years or for 1 year, and then having those contracts coincide with what that revenue sharing looks like for you. So let's say you're a quarterback coming into Texas, and you want to stay there for 2 years. You want to sign a 2-year contract. You would be making less hypothetically than the quarterback that signed at the same time that wants to stay for 3, because they know they have him locked down. They know that he's not going anywhere, and it helps out, just keeping kids where they are, which is a huge other battle. You want the transfer portal to be as benign as it possibly can be going forward, and that's probably going to be one of the solutions for that, where you can get a certain amount of money, but you got to give us, a certain amount of your time in return. So it'll be really interesting to see how that develops. I think most kids will figure out very quickly that they'd rather sign a 3-year deal with a school than a 1-year deal or 2-year deal, because I think they're figuring out that the transfer portal might just be a thing that you use, a break glass in case of emergency type of thing, not a entity that should be used willy-nilly. So we'll figure out what happens there. I think there's still a ton to be ironed out, but at the end of the day, it does feel like we're heading towards a players association. We're heading towards kind of a collective bargaining between the players and the powers that be in college football. And then you need a leader, right? You need someone that is going to step up. This is something that Dennis Dodd did an incredible job over at CBS, kind of breaking this down and some potential candidates for this position, because you need an adult in the room. As much as I trust, these athletes to go in that room and handle themselves with the utmost professionalism and do a fantastic job in those conversations, there needs to be someone that is a little bit more well-versed in contracts, a little bit more well-versed in, sports law, things that, you need in that room. So obviously there have been a couple of people that have kind of thrown their name into the ring. Jim Cavell is the founder of athletes.org that got UAB to sign. That's obviously a huge players association that has gotten into the party, so he's someone that has definitely been throwing his hat into the ring. Ramogi Huma is another one, head of the National College Players Association advocacy group. He was a former UCLA player and is current activist for player rights, so obviously someone that puts the players first, is trying to do a ton on the side, but if put in this situation could do a ton more, obviously. And then you have Jason Stahl, the founder of the College Football Players Association. So this is one that we've heard is not as big in favor of the employment model as others. So maybe if he was implanted, we'd have kind of a hybrid model. That's something definitely to watch. And then you have Jason Belzer, who's the founder and CEO of the Student Athlete NIL, which is another candidate of, leading this Players Association. So those are 4 people that you likely didn't know the name of. Let's be honest. And to be honest, about 2 weeks ago, I did not know the name of these people. But they're becoming huge players in college football. And they're becoming huge players because they're looking at the players and asking, what do you guys want? And actually listening. So it's a fascinating thing when college sports can actually figure out one of their biggest asset is the players and put them as forefront as you possibly can. And you've done that more and more with NIL and things of that nature, but you've also heard it with the way that NIL and the transfer portal and all this stuff was set up, where you were essentially just thrown into the fire and you started to put things together, and it didn't have a lot of cohesiveness, and it hurt. It hurt a lot of kids. So I think structure is absolutely necessary. It's absolutely needed for the players. It's something that the players probably should have had long ago, if we're being totally honest. But at the end of the day, very glad that they're starting to get to that point. But on the NCAA side of things, they need this to happen as much as the players do. And to be totally honest with you, I think if all things were equal, if the NCAA did not need this to happen, was not in the situation they're in, they would not be as inclined to necessarily be a part of this. But they're in a bad spot. And it's because of all the different cases that we have brought up a number of times. We had the House versus NCAA. We have Fontenot versus NCAA, which is another one that is going after broadcasting rights and saying they should absolutely, kids should be able to pay players from those broadcasting rights. You have Hubbard versus NCAA, which is a back pay type case again. And then you have Carter versus NCAA, which is another one that is going after, you shouldn't just pay room, board, tuition. You should have to, give them a certain amount of money for the time that they're putting in. So basically, the NCAA is being hit from 10 different directions. But the good news for them is if a players' association is put in place, if they get a collective bargaining agreement in place and it all makes sense and all the ducks are in a row, all 4 of those cases drop off their plate altogether. Just because all of those cases can pretty much be grouped together under the guise of they want players to be paid more money than they are currently. I think that's pretty much the gist of it, and definitely at least be a cut in on some type of regular basis salary, not necessarily, a bi-weekly or anything like that, but just they get a certain cut at every turn. There's not a, difference in performance. There's not a difference in play. It's a very concrete, crystallized structure. And if that happens, I think all of this stuff will go away. The NCAA will be in a better place, obviously still probably paying that $2.7 million in NIL back pay, but at least you get that off your back, right? And then you have Title IX implications that are very foggy, not sure how this is going to impact women's sports and non-revenue sports, and it's going to be a little bit of a mess on the back end, I'll be totally honest with you. And then you have expanded scholarships likely coming down the road. When you have more money going towards these athletes, there's going to be a little bit more money to go around. So I think there's going to be more scholarships, and also it's another way for the lower level or the players lower on the depth chart, the players that are maybe, get a little bit less money in the NIL, you can also subsidize that in another way. Instead of having to give them a ton of revenue sharing or give them a ton of NIL money, you can say, we'll give you the full scholarship, but that's going to be about it. So that's another way to kind of subside some of these worries. And then at the end, Dennis Dodd did touch on Congress getting involved. It's something that, to be totally honest with you, is likely required at some point in the future. Now, it is an election year, and it's probably not going to happen at least until 2025 comes around. So I wouldn't necessarily hold your breath there. I think that it's something that probably needs to happen just to get this all in place and we know what the rules are and everyone is on the same page. But it's going to take a minute to get there. So hopefully they have their ducks in a row by the time they get there. Hopefully that the NCAA's lawsuits are not necessarily at the place they are, because as we know with the NCAA, more lawsuits equals more money and more time and resources, and the NCAA is not necessarily at a point where they can just throw resources at the wall and be fine with it. So it'll be fascinating to watch all of this unfold. Collective bargaining is going to be a word, a term that you hear over and over, and it's something that is super important to the future of college football in particular, but also college sports in general. The fact that these kids who go through this on a daily basis, that put their body on the line every Saturday, or whatever sport you play, the people that, work tirelessly for their teams and for their universities, not being in on these conversations is outright ridiculous. I don't think there's much of an argument about that, but getting to that point is going to be huge, and it feels like we're starting to find our way there. But we'll figure out what happens there. We're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Brian Kelly. He made some very, very interesting comments around NIL and the transfer portal, and I want to break down why he's kind of right, but not necessarily in this circumstance. So I want to break that down after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear this shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all of the different cases going on with the NCAA and how collective bargaining is going to have to be a part of the answer. Revenue sharing has been brought up a lot, but one goes with the other. So we will definitely hear more about that down the road. But let's get into Brian Kelly and let's talk about the comments that he made on a local Stevie station with Jacques Doucet. I apologize if I got that wrong, at WFAB down in Baton Rouge. And he was interviewing Brian Kelly and they were talking about the recent transfer portal and how LSU did not necessarily fare as well as some had hoped, and especially at the defensive tackle position. So you asked kind of why that was, what happened in some of those recruitments, what happened in this entire portal cycle for you guys. And he got into kind of the classic, coach talk where they were talking about the NIL world and how it's so complicated. And he made the quote, "We are not in the market of buying players." And he followed it up, said, "Unfortunately, right now, that's what some guys are looking for. They want to be bought." So this is a sentiment you've heard tens of millions of times at this point, right? You've heard that players are only out for money. You've heard that players are going after certain things and they're not worrying about, where to be best developed and where to be put yourself in the best position to go to the NFL and get an education, all of this different stuff. And he's right. That is the reality of recruiting right now. There are a number of kids across the country that want to get the paycheck. And some of it is out of, needing that paycheck to a certain extent when they come into college. Some of it is, I am who I am and I want to be compensated that way. So a lot of this is really, really sketchy. And I think it's created a lot of talk around this comment. Some people saying, they're not willing to really play with the big dogs. They're broke, whatever you want to say about LSU. Overall, I think when you look at that comment at face value, he's right. I think he is unequivocally right. When you talk about college football and college sports, there are decisions that have to be made today that did not even have to be thought about a decade ago or even 5 years ago. So there are certain things that have to be in place right now that are just insanely hard to wrap your head around, including NIL, and especially NIL when you talk about the portal, because that's usually where you hear a lot of these stories of the kids really going after a huge payday is, they're coming for a year, they want to get a ton of money, and then move on to the NFL. So this is something that didn't really exist a couple of years ago and wasn't as big of a problem as it is today. But it's something that you have to prepare for. So as an athletic department, they've gotten their ducks in a row. They know how much each guy is worth, or they know what their cap is on how much they're willing to spend on a kid, and all of this different stuff that kind of goes into the portal recruiting, which actually something we'll get into in the last segment. But when we talk about LSU, they were going after a ton of defensive linemen in this last window. They were not able to land any of them yet. They did offer a defensive tackle at a Grand Valley State who's a very talented kid, so could reel him in, which would help out a little bit. But one of the people that has kind of been pointed at as why this statement was made, or one of the recruitments that was kind of the crux of all of this, is Dominic Williams, which is a fantastically talented defensive tackle that is now an Oklahoma Sooner. LSU and Texas were fighting for him for quite some time. And the story essentially went, the rumor, I want to make that very clear. I'm not necessarily saying this is exactly what happened, but the rumor is he had one number, and then that number really went up pretty quickly, and it went up to around $1.2, $1.4, $1.5 million. So it's a huge amount of money to give a kid. There's no two ways about that. And not necessarily saying he unequivocally asked for that amount of money, but there's been plenty of reports that have said that the dollar amount was substantial. Let's put it that way. So a couple of things. The amount of money for that kid is crazy. Dominic Williams is a fantastic player. There's no two ways about that. But they paid Bo Davis $1.5 million to coach defensive line. They can't have a defensive lineman making as much as their coach. They just can't. That's not something that can happen in a locker room right now. So I fully understand that. And I think if we're talking about this circumstance in particular, if you're talking about Dominic Williams and it was $1.2 million for this year, no is the right answer. Let's just put it that way. No is the correct answer. I don't know that's what Oklahoma paid, so I don't know that Oklahoma made a bad decision either. But LSU, I get it. The problem is LSU right now is not necessarily in the business of missing out on guys because of these discussions. And it's not that they should be, bending the knee to every single guy that walks in the door, because that's a dangerous way to go about business. I think we all understand that. But when you look at the LSU defensive line, it's outright bad. There's really no other way to put it. I'd love to put it nicer for LSU fans, but it's bad. They had a guy move over from offensive line to defensive line and is a second stringer right now. And if you've seen anything about offensive line moving to defensive line, it doesn't really work. There's not a lot of examples of guys really excelling on the defensive side of the ball after being an offensive lineman. So the fact that he's at a second string tells you a lot. They are in a position where they don't really have time to be the most moral program out there. And that sounds a little goofy. You want to stand on your principles. You want to be able to follow those rules time in and time out and not be wishy-washy. But he almost set himself up to be wishy-washy with this comment where there's going to be a kid that comes around that demands a lot of money. And I don't know that it's going to be a crazy amount of money like 1.5 or whatever, but he's going to demand a lot of money and you're going to give it to him. There's going to be that kid. Maybe Dominic Williams wasn't worth that money, which would have been a better comment if Brian Kelly had said that. I don't think people are really worrying about it because some kids aren't worth that money. I would argue Dominic Williams probably wasn't worth that money. But at the end of the day, LSU is a place where they should never be hurting for money. They should never be hurting for NIL funds. They should never have a defensive line that is as bad as they do right now. They should never be in this position, I guess is the best way to put it. But now you are. You are in this position where you have a defensive line that has an offensive lineman on the two deep. You have a defensive line that has one of the best coaches in the country, but not a lot to be done when you don't have the players to go around them. You are in a position where LSU should not be. So you kind of have to act differently than how LSU would act in this normal circumstance and how Brian Kelly would act in this normal circumstance. So we got into Dominic Williams, 1.5, 1.2, whatever it is, that's a no. That's fine. That's a right decision. I'm all for that. The problem is, once that happens, you have to go all out for every other kid that you have your eyes on. You have to do everything you can to get the kids that aren't at $1.2 million, that are at $400,000 or $600,000, whatever the number is for you, you have to go get those kids. It's not a negotiable thing. It's not something that you can, maybe they'll come around in the next portal cycle. You might not have until the next portal cycle. The SEC is getting to a point where there's not enough oxygen in the room. The same thing with the Big Ten. Some very good coaches are going to have to get fired because they can't win 10 games a year, or they can't do things that probably are not feasible in the new era of SEC football, which we'll get into probably on a segment maybe tomorrow. But when we talk about LSU in particular, they did an incredible job this offseason refurbishing that defensive staff. They did as good of a job flipping a side of the ball that I've ever seen from a coaching perspective. When you talk about bringing in Blake Baker as the defensive coordinator, Corey Raymond on the back end, Bo Davis as the interior defensive line, Kevin Peoples as the edge rushing and outside linebacker coach, it's insane who is in that room. That being said, you spent about $10 million to get it done, and that pulls away from what you can do on the NIL recruiting trail. Now, it shouldn't pull away that much because the reality is LSU is LSU. They should never be in a position where they're lagging behind in NIL. So here's the thing with all of this. I think the principle is correct. The principle that I am not going to be the place you go where you can just demand money and get paid, and that's just the way things go. I'm all for that. That is a sentiment that absolutely should be the case for LSU in 2025. It should not be the case right now, because the case right now is you're in a position where you're going to have almost a carbon copy of a year ago, except you might not have a Heisman winner at quarterback. So Brian Kelly's playing with fire a little bit here. And it's not to say that he is not able to be successful with the group that he has, because, as I said, the coaching staff is remarkable. There's so many different things that they can do with so many different kids, but also you got to meet them halfway. You got to give them some guys that are NFL talent guys. And when you look across that defensive line, there are a couple of guys that could pop up, but there's not enough. There's not nearly enough. So when you look at all this and you talk about what Brian Kelly said, I agree with what he said. I agree with the sentiment of what he's trying to do. I just think that's not the position that they're in currently. They're not in a position to necessarily have that stance, because you need dudes. You need guys to be a force on that defensive line, especially on that defensive line. So maybe you do bend a knee just a little bit, just for the time being, and then you can slowly start to reel that back as you get wins on the board, and it becomes easier, and kids are asking for less NIL money because they know they're competing for championships at LSU. So it's a tightrope walk, and Brian Kelly's trying to figure out where he wants to fall on all of this, because it is a confusing game. And with kids walking into your room asking for, $1.2 to $1.5 million, it's off-putting. There's no two ways about that. And it's a confusing world that we now live in. But I have a feeling that Brian Kelly is going to look back on this past portal cycle and possibly being a little bit stingy with NIL, not necessarily in the Dominic Williams case, but maybe in some other cases, and just not attacking the way that he probably should have. And it could mean that, you go 9-3 this year, and you go 9-3 the year after, and you keep going 9-3, and then people get a little bit upset in Baton Rouge. So I hope that doesn't happen. I think Brian Kelly is more than capable of figuring all this out and finding the right way forward. He obviously has a better grasp on what he wants to do than I do, but I just thought that statement overall, from where he sits today, is not necessarily the way to go about business. Now, it could be that in 2 years, where he sits, he can absolutely do that, and he should do that going forward. I think the best teams in the country do, but at the end of the day, it's not normal circumstances right now. And you kind of need bodies. You need a guy. And if it was, putting yourself in a little bit of a hole by signing Dominic Williams, if he was going to be a guy that put you over the edge, great. That you'd be calling your collective with no problem. So there were a couple of different things at play here. I think the comment itself is mostly fine. I think there was about 5 different ways that he could have phrased it that would have been a little bit better, whether it be saying something like, that guy just wasn't worth the money that he was asking for, or I'm just not in the business of, fully bending a knee to every single guy that walks in the room. Those would make sense. Now, saying you're not in the business of buying players, kind of a lie. Let's be totally honest with each other. That's kind of the reality of college football. There's very few programs out there that are not in that business at this point. But LSU is in an interesting spot, especially on that defensive line. And they did work in the portal to try to fix that, came up short on a number of different recruitments, and we might just look back on that as the moment where the Brian Kelly era in LSU kind of started to go awry. Now, I hope that's not the case. He has a great staff behind him that can make a lot of things happen, but you can't quite make them happen with the players that they have on the roster right now. But we'll see what happens. It'll be fascinating to watch this defense this upcoming year. But we're going to take our second break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about one of the weirder stories that I have seen in college football in quite some time. We're going to talk about Monte Harrison and his journey from high school football to the MLB and back to college football. So we'll break down that right after this.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Brian Kelly and his interesting comments around NIL, saying they are not in the market of buying players. He's kind of right, he's kind of not right, but I got into that a little bit, so if you want to check out that on the segment or on the channel, you absolutely can. But let's talk about Monte Harrison. This is one of the weirdest, one of the coolest stories that I've seen in college football in quite some time. It's something that I absolutely love and I think is going to be making a lot of people mad, but will be very, very fun to watch. So Monte Harrison is a guy that you probably don't know of, unless you were very, very into recruiting in 2014, then maybe you do. But if you're a Miami Marlins fan or or Angels fan, maybe you do as well. And yes, you heard me right. Those are two MLB teams. So this guy was a big-time high school recruit when he was coming out. He was a 4-star wide receiver that in the class of 2014 was with guys like Deebo Samuel and Isaiah McKenzie, was actually rated above DJ Chark in that recruiting class. So a very talented kid, was committed to Nebraska to play football and baseball. But then something happened, and he got drafted into the MLB in the second round. And I think everyone, including myself, would make the decision, I'm going to go to the MLB, I'm going to make some money. So that's exactly what he did. And it was an interesting time for the 10 years that he was in the MLB. He bounced around from minor league to professional, played professional for the Marlins and the Angels, as I said. And during his 57 career MLB at-bats, hit a 176 average, 2 home runs, over 10 seasoned, over professional ball overall, minor league and everything included. Hit 242, 97 home runs, 230 stolen bases, and spent time with the Angels, as we said, in 2022. So not that far removed from the MLB is this guy, and obviously some speed with him with those 230 stolen bases. So as a senior at Lee Summit West High in Missouri, in 2013, he caught 60 passes, over 1,000 yards, 13 touchdowns, signed his letter of intent to Nebraska, the Bo Pelini, Nebraska, if you remember that era. And he had offers from Arkansas, Iowa, Kansas, Kansas State, Michigan State, Missouri. So this was a very highly sought-after kid. This was the guy that was right below the, elite of the elite wide receivers in that class. So very, very big-time recruit. And when he got drafted in the MLB, found his way into baseball, but just a little bit ago, I guess, he turned over to football and said, why not? Let's go try that again. So there will be people online that will tell you, this guy's got to get a job, or this guy's got to get a 9-to-5, or move on, give it up, whatever. And you'll find mostly those guys have very little athletic ability and never played high-level sports, but that's beside the point. This guy is incredible in my mind. I'm being totally honest. I think there are a lot of people that, when Stetson Bennett was deep in his Georgia career, or Bo Nix a year ago, there's infinite. Michael Penix is another example of guys that are a little bit older that get a little bit of jokes on Twitter and things of that nature, where they say they got to go get a job, they got to go get ready to sell insurance, whatever it is. So this guy will get fun poked at him. But here's the thing. Playing football and playing professional football at this point at the college level is so much cooler than what 95% of the population does on a daily basis. Like, being out there as an Arkansas Razorback, going through drills, being an elite athlete is so much cooler than what I'm doing on a daily basis. It's so much cooler than what all of us, for the most part, are doing on a daily basis. So do it as long as you possibly can. If your body is able to play college football right now, play college football. I mean, shoot, like, it's a great way to go about your time. And also, he's being a walk-on. So especially if you're not taking away a scholarship from another kid, do your thing. It's going to be incredible to watch. And so I don't think anyone's going to be able to change my mind on how awesome this is. I think this is going to be one of the coolest stories ever. I really hope he becomes like one of the best receivers for Arkansas this upcoming year, although that is a very, very long shot. But at the end of the day, it's really cool to watch. It's a kid, being able to live out one dream and playing the MLB and then go back and take another shot and live out possibly another dream and playing in college football. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this guy. There could be a 32-year-old making plays for Arkansas in 2027. So it's going to be wild to watch this. It's going to be one of the most interesting things that we've seen in college football in quite some time. But I think one of the big things here is I think a lot of people, when they look at this situation in particular, I think they'll look at it as this is just a guy that wants to go dominate kids and wants to go back and, live out the glory days and utilize his superior strength or whatever. They try to tear him down in some way, saying he made this decision for any number of reasons. I would argue the most likely decision that was made was he wants to go back and get his degree. He never got a chance to go to college and have that experience. He wants to go back, get that piece of paper, and then he looked over and said, well, I'm pretty good at football. I might as well give a chance and join the Razorbacks. So I think it was more, school preceded the football decision, but regardless of what the decision was made, I'm all for it. I think this is going to be incredible to watch. I think he's someone that I'm going to be really hoping to see on my screen in 2024 in the fall, but we'll see what happens. It's going to be awesome to watch this guy, and honestly, this is not something that is totally unheard of, although there hasn't been someone that made it all the way to the MLB that then find their way back. Chris Winke, who is someone who is a fantastic player who has, tons of history in college football, was drafted in 1990 to the NFL after coming out of high school. He was committed to Florida State at the time, was actually on campus in August for about 4 days, but then got drafted, decided to go into the MLB, was in the single A affiliate for the Blue Jays, was all over the place, but Bobby Bowden told him right when he left, essentially, he has a scholarship for him whenever he wants to come back. And he decided to come back. 6 years later, he decided to come back to Florida State in 1996 after 6 years in the minor leagues, and he had a remarkable career. As I'm sure some of you remember, it was a little bit before my time, but he won a Heisman Trophy in 2000, was one of, the heydays for Florida State football when you remember those teams, so was a huge part of that. So this is not necessarily the craziest thing in the world. This is not something that we have absolutely no precedent for, so it'll be really interesting to see if Monte Harrison can follow that same path. Now, he's not going to win a Heisman. I can say that pretty confidently, but he could be someone that maybe we find him on the field on Saturdays and 3:30 on CBS, and he wows us. Who knows? Maybe he really, really bursts onto the scene and goes to the NFL at 33 years old. I don't know, but it'll be incredible to watch this kid. I think one of the really, really cool things about college football and college sports in general is the eligibility doesn't run out. You have every ability to find your way back to something that you loved as a high schooler and loved as a kid, and get your shot at it. So Monte Harrison obviously made a decision that is going to be one that raises a lot of eyebrows, is going to be one that a lot of people decide to tear down or decide to make fun of him or, do whatever, because that's what people online like to do. But this guy is doing something that I wish I would be able to do, to be totally honest with you. If I could live out his life right now, I would trade places in an instant. When you talk about being able to play on the biggest stage in baseball and then go back and being able to play in front of SEC stadiums, that's about as good of a life as he gets. So hopefully, all this goes very, very smoothly for Harrison. Hopefully he's able to, get on the field a little bit, get a degree, do all the things that he came to do. And I think it's just an awesome thing. I think it's something that gives these guys who want to come back to school and have that eligibility something to do. And it gives them another way to enjoy their time in college and get to know people and possibly get back into a sport that they love so much. I mean, someone like Monte Harrison was a huge recruit in high school, so when you talk about that, that means he was around the sport for a very, very long time during that time in his life, and I think it could be this is a stepping stone to get back into it. So it'll be really fascinating to find out what happens with all of this. I think he is one of the most fascinating stories in all of college football right now, and likely will be for a number of years going forward. But this is just a really, really cool story, if you were to ask me, and I think it's something that people will really, really be coming around on slowly as it kind of goes on. But Monte Harrison, officially an Arkansas Razorback, officially a part of the SEC, and we'll see what happens. We'll see if some of that baseball skills can transfer over, and if he can unlock some of that elite athletic ability he had back in the day as a wide receiver down there in Missouri. So it'll be fascinating to watch. It'll be one of the best stories throughout this year and the next couple of years. But shout out to Sam Pittman for giving this guy an opportunity. Shout out to Monte Harrison for taking the leap that I think a lot of us would be a little bit scared to take. But it's going to be a great story, and I cannot wait to watch it unfold. But we're going to take our final break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Clemson, and we're going to talk about a Hot Take Thursday I have on them. Their portal strategy has been very, very steadfast for the past couple of years, but I think they might have just passed the point of no return. So I want to get into that right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the very, very interesting story of Monte Harrison, who found his way to the MLB, found his way back to college football. He is now an Arkansas Razorback. So if you want to check out that story, I have a segment up on the page very shortly after this. But let's talk about a Hot Take Thursday that I have, and it has everything to do with Clemson and the portal. As you saw, I'm sure, over this last little bit, Clemson has had no one come in through the portal. They have had 13 guys portal out. They have had 0 guys portal in. And it's something that has been a trend around Clemson for quite some time. Dabo Swinney has been very, very clear that he has no desire to use the transfer portal, and that has come to fruition. He has brought in 2 players throughout his time through the transfer portal throughout his time at Clemson. One was Hunter Johnson, who was already at Clemson prior to moving on to Northwestern, and then one was Paul Tyson, which was just out of outright necessity for another quarterback when DJ Uiagalelei found his way to Oregon State. So I think this is something that Dabo's made his decision, right? He is firm, he's dug in, and that's the way it's going to be. The problem is, I think that decision is officially out of his hands going forward. I don't think there's a decision that can be made next cycle where you now want to jump back in. And there's a couple of different reasons for that, but a couple of the really, really big ones is one of them we talked about actually yesterday when we were talking about the portal and how it wasn't quite as crazy as some of us thought, and some of the reasons for that. One of the big reasons was players are getting smarter. They're fully understanding what the portal means, and they're going to be more wary of it because the grass isn't always greener on the other side. So players are going to be a little bit more wary, but even more so, the teams have started to find a rhythm of which players you want to go after, which players are worth which dollar figure. All of this stuff kind of goes into the portal recruiting, and it's something that for the past 3 years, every school across the country has been trying to get their head around, except for Clemson. And it's not to say that Clemson hasn't had these conversations. I'm sure they have, but it's different than having a conversation than actually being out there recruiting these kids and being in the fight. So it's a different game. That's just the reality. So I don't think any type of planning on a whiteboard can prepare you for when you actually get into these recruiting battles in the portal trail. So, and then finally, the portal is going to be a part of the future of college football. That's just kind of the way it is. But I do think the worst is behind us. I think we have found a plateau of sorts in the portal where we will have roughly the same number of kids going in most cycles. Maybe it'll start to taper off even a little bit, to be totally honest with you. So all of this stuff kind of plays into why Clemson is in a little bit of a tough spot. All of these things really hurt their ability to jump into the party now, and the biggest thing for me is what I was just talking about, the absolutely very little gauge on how they want to attack the portal, which positions they want to go after, which teams are the teams that they want to attack, which, how much money you're giving these kids, how the recruiting visits go. All of this stuff really matters. And it's something Clemson has never really had to deal with. Hunter Johnson, when he came in, was probably just, you want to come back? Yeah. And that was the entire conversation. Paul Tyson was just looking for another place to play, and I don't think that was much hard at all. So these things are very tough to figure out, and you really only figure them out by trial by fire, by figuring them out by going through these recruitments and putting these kids' feet to the fire and figuring out what the landscape is out there. So this is something that you really can't replace anything with just reps in the portal. It's the same way of you can't replace anything with game day reps. You need to be on the field. You need to be throwing passes. You need to be seeing it in real time. The same way Clemson needs to be seeing the portal react in real time and be a part of it before they can actually utilize it the way that they're more than capable of doing. But it's just going to be tough to get to that point. So I think there's tons of things at play here, and there's a couple of big caveats overall when we talk about Clemson in general. One, Dabo Swinney knows infinitely more about football and how to build a program than I ever will. I'm openly admitting that. I'm not saying that Dabo Swinney is necessarily wrong for not using the portal the way he has, although it's not the way that I would go about business. He can still be successful. There's no two ways about that. There is a path for them to be the Clemson that we all have gotten accustomed to, where they're competing for national titles, they're winning the ACC, they're doing those things, and they can do it without the portal. But it makes the tightrope walk that much tighter, and it makes it tougher when everyone around you, especially the teams in the ACC, are utilizing it to the best of their ability and are getting better day over day over day. So it's something that Clemson is really, really going to have to think about. And the second big caveat, and the caveat that changes this entire thing, is if Clemson wins this year, it doesn't matter. All of this stuff is a wash, and, attack the portal however which way you want, because if you're winning football games, it's not a problem. But one thing that, we just talked about, but I've seen throughout the past couple of weeks and really the entirety of the postseason, is every team in the ACC has gotten better. It feels like there are very few teams across the ACC that really struggled this offseason. I mean, you could talk about Virginia, you can talk about some of the smaller teams in the bunch, but Miami has gotten infinitely better, especially on the defensive side of the ball, and then bringing in Cam Ward is just insane. And then you add FSU. They've reloaded. Now it could be a little bit more of a tightrope walk than it was a year ago, but they still have plenty of talent, especially on that defensive side of the ball. NC State has gotten a much better team that is very dangerous this year. Louisville just continues to get better after a remarkable 2023. So all of the teams around you are utilizing this thing that you are shunning away and you're refusing to use, and they're using it as well as pretty much anyone in the country. And that puts you at a position where you have to over-deliver what they're doing. You have to overdo them, because there's going to be circumstances where there's not a scenario where you're walking into every game where you're just physically and talent-wise better than everyone else. That used to be the case in the ACC. It is no longer the case. You are not going to be outright more talented than Florida State when you walk on that field. Miami is honestly kind of a toss-up when you talk about talent on both those rosters. So it's going to be tough. And it feels like Clemson has missed the train and everyone else didn't. And now they were well ahead of everyone else. There's no two ways about that. But they're catching up. And they're catching up rather quickly, and we've seen it over the last couple of years. So overall, if Dabo and Clemson can win with this philosophy, great. That'd be a fantastic way to build a program. It's honestly the way that I would prefer that a program be built. But when you look at the way of college football right now, it's not the best way for a program to be built, in my mind. So this is something that I've said, time and again. I don't necessarily love the way that they're going about business in the portal. I don't necessarily love the way that Dabo has, approached this. But he's made his decision. He's made his bed. Now you got to lie in it. And it could be not a great sleep. I'll be totally honest with you. I like Dabo. I think he's one of the best coaches in recent memory. I think he has immense amount of ability and can pull a rabbit out of a hat and can do incredible things this year. It's just he's making it tougher on himself than he needs to, I guess is the best way to put this. Every program around him is utilizing this big time thing that can help your program year over year, and you can utilize it in a smart way and not, sell your soul and lose some of the values that are there at Clemson while still being able to compete with the big time players. And it's not just ACC teams. They have to keep up with everyone. They want to get out of the ACC, and they're likely going to the SEC when that comes. Things get a lot tougher then. So Clemson is in a point where you've made your decision. You're not going to be a portal team. At least you're not going to be a super effective portal team, at least for the next 5 years, if you switch right now. If you change paths right this second, maybe you could pick up some kids. Maybe you could make some things happen, but it's going to take you some time to get up to the level of these other programs, and then they'll be further along. So Clemson, in my mind, has missed the boat. And the question is, how much does that matter? It could be that, they don't need the portal. They're Clemson. They can handle whatever you throw at them, and it's not going to be a problem. It could be that this spells, the end of the Dabo era in Clemson and the reign that he has had. So there's a lot of stuff at play. There's a lot of different variables here, and I think for the most part, if you ask me to pick one side or the other, I would say Clemson's likely to continue down this path and slowly start dropping more and more games. And I don't think we're anywhere remotely close to Dabo Swinney not being the head coach over there, but the longer that this goes on, the longer that Clemson sits pat and stays where they are, which is towards the top of the ACC, but the longer that they sit still, the closer that everyone else gets. And we found it the last couple of years, and it could be that some of them are passing them. And I really hope that Clemson either, changes ways or can make this all work. But whatever it is, the decision has been made, and it could spell disaster for Clemson if they're not very, very careful. But we'll see what happens. It'll be a fascinating thing to watch. Dabo Swinney is constantly one of the most fascinating people to watch in the sport, and especially when he talks about the portal and the way he does, it's something to behold. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does mean a world to us. Also, we invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the updates you could possibly need. We have incredible people doing work across every sport you could think of. So whatever you need in the world of sports, come on over to GSMC and we have you covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Let's go.